Second reading of the Historical Institutional Abuse Northern Ireland Bill, Lord Duncan of Springbank.
My Lords, I beg to move that the bill be read a second time. My Lords, this month the people of Northern Ireland saw the political impasse reach 1,000 days. 1,000 days without a functioning executive. Over 1,000 days without progress in education, in health and infrastructure and many other areas of devolved competence. The impact of this impasse has been acutely felt, perhaps more than by any other, by the victims and the survivors of historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Executive established an independent inquiry into historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland in 2012. The inquiry's report was published the same month as the collapse of the Executive. As a consequence, the Northern Ireland Executive never considered a report, and it was not laid before the Northern Ireland Assembly. The victims have been left hanging for 7 long years. My Lords, this wait must now come to an end. That is why the Government committed in July to introduce legislation in Westminster by the end of this year, and why today it has made a fresh commitment to implementing the legislation and ensuring the victims and survivors receive an initial acknowledgement payment as soon as possible following the bill's passage.
I'm very grateful so early in his speech. I very much welcome this bill and his urgency over it. Could he give the House any guidance as to how quickly this will get through? Many of us would support an accelerated programme, especially in view of the possible general election, and it would be tragic for those victims of the abuse if it stalled somehow in a parliamentary logjam.
I welcome the noble Lord's intervention so early in my speech, and I would ask all those who do speak today to speak in such similar terms. With that assurance, I believe I can move this forward very swiftly indeed, and I believe that the usual channels will be consulted to that end to ensure that we are not caught in the very limbo of a difficulty that might follow an announcement of a general election. I have no desire now to see this carried over. I would much rather this be done as quickly as we possibly can. Just to return to the bill, if I may, this legislation sets out the necessary legal framework to deliver 2 of the key recommendations from the Historical Institutional Abuse Report. Firstly, a Historical Institutional Abuse Redress Board to administer a publicly funded compensation scheme for victims in Northern Ireland. This will be a panel composed of a judicial member and 2 health and social care professionals. Appointments to the board will be made by the Lord Chief Justice and the Executive Office of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Secondly, the creation of a statutory commissioner for survivors of institutional childhood abuse for Northern Ireland, who will act as an advocate for victims and survivors and support them in applying to the redress board. As noble Lords will know, providing redress for the victims and survivors of such abuse in Northern Ireland is a devolved matter. The Government is acting on behalf of the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the Northern Ireland parties to enact the legislation here at Westminster. Crucially, the bill has been drafted by the Northern Ireland Civil Service at the request of and based on a consensus reached by all of the main Northern Ireland parties. Sadly, Westminster is simply the only available vehicle for the delivery of this bill at this time. My Lords, I've spoken to colleagues across this House, and in reference to the remarks made by the noble Lord Hayne, I believe that the message has been received loud and clear both in this House and in the other place. If the noble Lords can give those assurances which I seek, then I will be in a strong position to ensure that we are able to make very rapid progress indeed on this bill. In relation to the payments themselves and the speed with which they can be made, Clause 14 of this bill contains provisions to allow the Redress Board to make an initial acknowledgement payment of £10,000 to eligible claimants before the full consideration of their claim. Clause 7 of this bill also allows the Redress Board to take a flexible case management approach to claims, to ensure that those who are elderly or are in severe ill health are considered as a priority. That means those who are in the greatest need of redress will get their payments more quickly. And Clause 6 of this bill allows claims to be made on behalf of a deceased person by their spouse or by their children. And crucially, the Secretary of State has tasked officials and the Northern Ireland Civil Service to look at options for implementing this legislation as soon as it becomes law. We cannot lose a single day on this matter. Regarding the ability for applicants to request an oral hearing, an issue that I know certain noble Lords have raised, This bill includes provisions for oral hearings at the discretion of the Redress Board, where it is necessary in the interest of justice. This provision ensures that oral hearings are available when required, but will not act as an unnecessary delay for those cases in which oral evidence is not required. In terms of the criteria that the Board will consider, the Redress Board will consider a number of factors, including and importantly the duration of an applicant's stay in the institution when reaching a final compensation decision. Each application will be decided on its merits on a case-by-case basis. And finally, regarding the role of the Commissioner, Clause 25 of the Bill enables the Commissioner to make representations to any person about matters concerning the interests of victims and survivors, including the Redress Board. In conclusion, my Lords, the victims and survivors of historical institutional abuse have waited too long. Let us get this done. I commend this bill to the House.
The question is, this bill be read a second time?
My Lords, there is complete support right across the House for this bill. It's very welcome, but it is, of course, shocking that we are talking about generations of abuse and decades of waiting for the potential to resolve what has happened. That the range of abuse which has been shown in the report covers the entire gamut, and obviously the legacy of abuse for those who have survived and sadly those who did not survive is clearly long-lasting. Siblings have been split up, sometimes never to see each other again, or perhaps only very much later in life. Parents and children have lost touch, and people have suffered psychological and physical trauma, which has made them handicapped for life, and in many cases deprived of the opportunity to fulfil their potential. But can I welcome one or two things specifically in the bill? In particular, I was pleased to note the explicit role of the Commissioner, not just to publicise the scheme and advise and support and give help to people to apply for it, but it's much more than money we're talking about here. And the role of the Commissioner to provide both general counselling services for those who have suffered, who maybe haven't had them till the point where they present themselves, and also to provide practical help with literacy and numeracy, education, employment, training, an opportunity, particularly for those who are perhaps not so far advanced in life, because we're talking about the later years of the covered by the Act, to have a chance perhaps to make some positive development in spite of the abuse that they have experienced. So I do welcome that, and I hope that the Commissioner and the Commission will be really, really active in involving people in that. The other point that I would make is really about the finance and the speed and the timing, because I was concerned, and I just would be grateful if the Minister, when he's replying, could clarify the position, both for me and for the benefit of those who may be taking advantage of the legislation. But the specifics are that it is going to be financed out of the budget of the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly, which of course is not functioning, and it will require consent across the board, and it will have to compete with funding for other services, which many noble lords, and I'm looking particularly at Lord MP, has highlighted, for example, how seriously underfunded things like health and education are. So one can see a problem here unless some of this money is ring-fenced, and it would be a travesty if, having got the mechanisms in place, the funding was not really there to deliver the scale, because after all we're talking about the possibility of somebody getting an award of up to £100,000 in addition to the extra services that they may require. So it is not an insignificant sum of money. So I would be grateful if the Minister, in winding up, would give some indication of, first of all, what money will be put in the beginning to get the process started, and anything positive he can say about how we can ensure it could be funded, because the last thing we want to do is to be back here in a few years' time complaining we set up a wonderful scheme but actually people found it was slow, tedious, they didn't really get the resolution they'd hoped for. And let's be clear, my lords, many people have died, many people have failed to get the support and the recognition that they needed in the time that they had. But that said, I think along with I think all members who have taken an interest in this particular subject. The only final point I would take is, of course, in this context, Northern Ireland is leading the way, ironically, and credit to the ministers, credit to the civil servants, credit to the parties for doing that. But it seems to me that we have to be realistic. This kind of abuse was not confined to Northern Ireland. We know it happened in Scotland, we know it happened in England, we know it happened in the Channel Islands, and of course we know it happened in the Republic of Ireland, which is not our responsibility, but nevertheless there's a legacy there. That being the case, let us hope that this proves to be, if you like, a beacon of how it can be done, and that it is taken up by the other components of the United Kingdom to deliver redress for all of those who have suffered institutional abuse, not just those in Northern Ireland.
Lords, I welcome the bill before your Lordship's House. And I wish to congratulate the Minister and officials for their efforts in preparing this legislation and by moving forward quickly with this process today. In these deeply fraught and uncertain times, when there are different views and opinions on a wide range of issues, I trust, my Lords, that there will be common ground and unanimity today in our efforts to deliver for victims of historical abuse. They have waited far too long. First, I wish to take one moment to pay tribute to the work of the late Sir Anthony Hart. Sir Anthony chaired the inquiry which began this process. His inquiry investigated and revealed the depth and the scale of the systemic abuse which was rife in our society. We must also acknowledge his expert team of officials who worked efficiently and diligently during the Hart inquiry. The inquiry resulted in some key recommendations for redress, and that work was a vital, important step in the process of getting us to this point today. For many victims of abuse, the Hart inquiry was the first time they had told their stories publicly. It must have been an incredibly challenging and difficult experience for them, and we should recognise that. After their bravery, many have been left without the much-needed assistance and support they require. Sadly, a number of victims have since passed away without seeing any justice. It is therefore right and proper that their families should receive financial and mental health support, as families have suffered too. Victims have shown great courage, bravery and extraordinary patience during their long campaign for redress. Lives have been destroyed, and some of their stories are harrowing. These victims have patiently continued to engage and interact respectfully with government and members both here and in the other place. It is welcome that an interim advocate is in place. In reality, however, victims, groups and families have done much of the work on their own for many years without any additional funding or administrative support. My Lords, there is an understandable sense of frustration amongst victims and the wider public at the length of time this process has taken. Since the report and the initial findings 3.5 years ago, this has been a long, uncertain process. This matter should have been addressed by a functioning assembly, but regrettably, the institutions were collapsed before a resolution could be found. For the victims who have suffered, this process was always about the truth. Regrettably, the report sat for too long before this process moved forward. The legislation before us today is vital in getting some justice for those who have suffered. There is a huge amount of cross-community and cross-party support for progressing this bill quickly. To do so would be an important step for the victims who have waited long enough. My Lords, when one looks at international examples where similar schemes have been introduced, institutions involved have taken responsibility and borne some of the considerable costs. One key example of this can be found in the National Redress Scheme in Australia. Through the Australian redress model, churches and other organisations responsible for institutional abuse opted in at an early stage to join the regular compensation scheme for victims. This was heralded by victim groups in Australia as a significant development. Also, in the Republic of Ireland, property owned by the responsible institutions has been expropriated. Can the Minister please confirm whether or not similar steps will be taken to adopt a group and institution opt-in approach to compensating victims where costs would be contributed to by named institutions and groups involved? And I would also be extremely grateful to the Minister if he would provide some clarity regarding the timetable for the rollout and introduction of the redress scheme. My Lords, these victims should be a top priority for Parliament. Many of them have lived for decades with mental and physical scars from childhood. This has been a long wait for justice. Today we have an opportunity to stand up for them. We must progress this legislation here in your Lordship's House and in the other place. If Parliament can pass other measures, as it has relating to Noel Allen in short order, surely it can swiftly pass this highly important legislation. Given the circumstances, the sooner we progress this, the sooner the redress scheme will be up and running for the victims. My party and I fully support this bill.
My Lords, the Noble Lord the Minister will be aware that I have been a frequent critic of Northern Ireland legislation coming to this House under accelerated passage, given the fact that in some cases we knew a year in advance that it needed to be done at a particular time. However, like other speakers, I believe that there's an opportunity here, not only for the use of that process, but to ensure, as was pointed out by the Noble Lord Hayne, who's not in his place at the moment, that we would not wish this legislation to be caught up in any possible wash-up and change in the parliamentary thing and therefore lost. I think, given that our minds today have to be focused on the victims and their families, what a cruel card would be dealt to them if having come to this stage it was all snatched away again at the very last minute. So I hope, using the other channels, it will be possible for the Minister and his right honourable friend in the other place to ensure that this legislation is dealt with. Because I believe that is the wish of the House, and I'm quite certain it's the wish of all the political parties in Northern Ireland and indeed in this House too. Sadly, Sir Tony has died earlier this year and has not seen the rollout of his recommendations, and that's a shame. But I've absolutely no doubt in supporting the point that Lord Brown has just made about the role of some of the institutions that have been involved and have to take responsibility, and that they and their insurers should not be allowed simply to get away in the smoke and the taxpayer take up all the liability. So I believe that the Minister and the Secretary of State have got that particular message. It's sad that Stormont is not in a position to deal with this, but there we are, and I think Parliament now has a responsibility to fill the vacuum and ensure that this is done. There are very few occasions when there's unanimity at home in Northern Ireland, and indeed, by the look of things around here, there's very little opportunity for unanimity here as well. But the fact remains that this is an opportunity for that to happen. And let's make it happen. Let's do something for the victims. Let them feel at last that they've been heard and that the system is actually working for them for once instead of against them. And I support the second reading of this bill.
My Lords, I am certainly not going to disturb the unanimity, but could I also say that it is heartening to note that the Secretary of State is following our proceedings, and we hope that this will give an added impetus to a very important bill indeed. It's a scandal that it has taken so long. It is very sad that it is over 2 years since the Hart report was published, and Sir Anthony is no longer able to see what we are seeking to achieve on his behalf. But the biggest scandal of all is that this matter, affecting as it does a number of extremely vulnerable people in Northern Ireland, has not been debated in full in the Assembly because the Assembly has not sat during the period since the publication of the report, which is the foundation of this bill. my noble friend Lord Duncan, to whom I pay unreserved compliments because he has been indefatigable. But he, earlier this afternoon, welcomed a suggestion of mine that it would be a very good thing if the Prime Minister went and summoned all the members of the Assembly to Stormont. And as he has styled himself Minister for the Union, let him tell them how keenly he feels for the Union and how important it is that they cast aside their differences and come together as an Assembly with an executive to exercise the power that this Parliament has conferred upon them. It is extremely important that that should happen. It is disgraceful that it has taken so long. But, my Lords, when my noble friend introduced the bill, he made a very powerful, short speech in which he said that he wanted to feel he had the support of your lordships in all parts of the House. I think he now knows he has that support, and I hope that he and the Secretary of State between them will ensure that whenever the election comes, this bill has passed into an Act of Parliament and received the royal assent before any election day. There is a will for this to be done. There is a unanimity in this House and in Northern Ireland, and it is crucial that we act.
My Lords, like all other speakers, I am entirely supportive of this bill and believe we really do need to get on with it. I do have some questions which I hope the Minister might be able to answer at the end of the debate. All the evidence about child abuse, whether physical, sexual or emotional, is that it's much more prevalent than people imagine, and revelations about past cases often lead to more people coming forward. So the new Abuse Redress Board and Commissioner will likely shine a light on the tips of many new icebergs, and exposing the whole edifice of historical institutional abuse is a process which I think will take years, not months, and collecting the evidence will be a long and complex task requiring detailed research and investigation. Yet the bill is rather vague about how the Board and Commissioner will be funded in the long term. I entirely agree with the points made by my noble friend earlier, but can the Minister also tell the House what the Government's estimate is of the funding required to ensure that the Board and the Commissioner can function properly? And can he confirm that it will be given resources equal to the tasks of meeting the needs that are of the victims? The Clause 23 of the bill enables the Commissioner to appoint an advisory board of victims of historical abuse. This strikes me as essential in itself, but it's equally critical that the advisory board is diverse and properly representative of the different groups of victims. I believe the House should consider whether such a requirement should be hardwired into the bill. Clause 21 of the bill sets out the process of appointment of the Commissioner, which is left in the hands of the Northern Ireland Executive Office, who will also have to approve the annual budget. Can the Minister reflect on how we ensure that these two provisions do not undermine the independence of the Commissioner in carrying out their work? We have to ensure that the Commissioner is well-resourced, well-advised and able to operate without fear or favour. Meanwhile, a successful Commissioner and a successful compensation scheme will be judged by the breadth of victims who seek to secure remedies and by the perceived fairness of the decisions which are taken in these cases. Can the Minister therefore look at the bill's provisions on who can make claims and when they can be made? Two things. First, the bill says the claim must be made within 5 years of the scheme being advertised. It strikes me, both because of the likelihood of one set of victims coming forward leading to another set being revealed, and because of the victims, many of whom are now in Australia, that this might be too tight a timescale. So can the Minister say how the 5-year position was arrived at, and whether he would look favourably at allowing claims for a longer period, perhaps at the Commissioner's discretion? Second, the bill accepts in principle that where a victim is deceased, a partner with whom they've cohabited should be able to claim on behalf of the estate. But it stipulates that the cohabiting partner must have lived with them immediately before their death. It's always difficult to legislate round family life, but has the Minister considered the possibility that some cohabiting partners may have lived with somebody for the majority of their lives, decades perhaps, but for one reason or another has not lived with them in the days immediately before the partner's death? Shouldn't the cumulative time together be a factor in these difficult cases? Finally, I want us to consider the role of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and the impact its recommendations should have both on government and on the Commissioner's work. Can we have some reassurance that the Commissioner will draw on the huge body of evidence collected by this inquiry, and in turn that the government will look again at the strong case for mandatory reporting? Getting the bill done and getting the bill right could scarcely be of greater importance. Out there await, tragically, thousands of people whose lives have been wrecked by abuse in their childhoods. People who told the Truth Project that they felt safer in police cells than at home, who've said they tried to tell social workers about what had happened to them, but had never been believed, and who've said that lasting damage inflicted on them by rapists and abusers lead them to a daily dilemma between living with what happens in their heads and killing themselves. My Lords, we owe those thousands of people whatever measure of justice we can now attain for them after decades of being ignored.
My Lords, as has been made very clear during the course of the debate so far, this is a hugely important piece of legislation for a great many people in Northern Ireland, in particular those many young and vulnerable people who suffered at the hands of those they should have been able to trust, whether in state-run or other institutions. I have, therefore, no hesitation at all in giving the bill my fullest possible support, which I know has cross-party backing from across political parties and the community in Northern Ireland. My great regret, however, is that, along with many other members of this House, is that it has taken us so long to arrive at this moment. Before that, I will say a bit more about that shortly, but before, I would like to commend the previous Northern Ireland Executive under Peter Robinson and the late Martin McGuinness for establishing the inquiry under Sir Anthony Hart in 2011-2012. And I'd like to echo my noble friend Lord MP in paying tribute to Sir Anthony. I am by instinct not naturally drawn towards public inquiries, but the Hart inquiry was widely regarded as a model of how a public inquiry should be run, in this case efficiently, forensically, with great authority, along with compassion and deep sensitivity. Along with the former Secretary of State Karen Bradley, I last met Sir Anthony at Hillsborough in May of this year to try and chart a way forward. And at that meeting, one could not have been anything but impressed by the sense of duty he had towards those who had suffered, his determination to do right by them, and his frustration that over 2 years after the publication of his report, the recommendations had still not been implemented. As Lord MP, my noble friend Lord MP said, Sir Anthony sadly passed away in July, yet hopefully this legislation will be a worthy legacy to a kind and decent man. Most of all, however, we should have nothing but admiration and support for the victims of historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland, people who have campaigned over the years with such determination, resilience and enormous courage. Their dignity, composure and their bravery has been quite remarkable, and that it has taken so long for this legislation to be introduced to give redress to them really is unforgivable. As one who served in the Northern Ireland office throughout this period, I'm profoundly sorry for that, and it's on those delays that I wish very briefly to comment now. As has been pointed out, the Hart report was delivered to the Executive in January 2017, a short while before the Executive itself fell, and therefore the Executive had no opportunity to consider properly its recommendations. As a result, like so many other pressing matters in Northern Ireland, it fell into a kind of limbo awaiting the re-establishment of devolved government. My Lords, I am a very strong supporter of the Belfast Agreement and believe that we should do everything possible to uphold the devolution settlement. And it was understandable, therefore, that in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Stormont, Westminster did not immediately rush in, and that some time was given to see if the devolved institutions could be re-established. But we should not have left it as long as we did. Indeed, sometimes I felt the issue was being deliberately used by some as a form of leverage on the Northern Ireland parties to go back into government. Just as infuriating were the arguments put forward by some that by acting in Westminster we might somehow be creating a dangerous precedent. My Lords, that was just wrong. And as I said on meetings on many occasions, when people are suffering and seeking redress, whether it be the victims of historical abuse or the victims of the Troubles awaiting some form of payment, they really do not care whether an issue is reserved or devolved. They rightly just want to see government action, particularly when there is no assembly or the immediate prospect of its return. I welcome the fact that the Northern Ireland Civil Service, under the leadership of David Stirling, was able to draft legislation, and that the current Secretary of State's predecessor, I'm pleased to see him following our proceedings today, the former Secretary of State, Karen Bradley, was able to take this forward with the local parties. My right honourable friend in the other place was unfairly accused of stalling the legislation earlier this year and was subjected to some vicious and totally unjustified media attacks. In fact, I can testify that nobody was more frustrated with the delays and more determined to achieve the right outcomes for victims. She was, though, keen to ensure that the legislation had the widest possible support so that once it was brought before either Westminster or Stormont, it could proceed apace with little or no amendment. And I strongly hope that is the case with this bill that the Government has now introduced. People have waited far too long, and the last thing they want is a protracted parliamentary process. And if, my Lords, there is a general election and this legislation falls as a result, I hope that there can be some kind of cross-party agreement that whatever the outcome, the bill will be quickly brought back and fast-tracked through both Houses of Parliament. The victims deserve nothing less. My Lords, for many people in Northern Ireland, this legislation has come too late, and I totally understand and share the frustration and anger over the delays. The key now is to get on with it, and as quickly as possible, so that victims can receive the redress they both expect and deserve. I am pleased to support this bill.
My Lords, I, like other members of this House, certainly support the bill coming to the House here this afternoon. And I welcome the fact that the Minister is very aware of the urgency in dealing with this particular issue. And there's unanimity around the House trying to get this bill sooner than earlier. Some of these victims have lived for over 70 years with the abuse that they suffered at the hands of these institutions. 30 victims have already died, and every day there's also victims dying on this whole issue. So it's very, very important that this House deals with it. And there was relief after political agreement was reached by the Northern main political parties to deal with the issue here at Westminster. And I know some members have mentioned the Assembly and the Executive. Yes, sad to say, this is an issue that should have been dealt with by our local devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. And a question earlier from Lord Laxton, I have questioned continually the process that both the Government and the parties are involved in now. After almost 3 years, it has not delivered devolution for Northern Ireland. And we all question the process that both the Government and the political parties are now involved in. And let me say, for the survivors, it's about much more than monetary compensation. That comes secondary to an apology from the state and institutions responsible. And a package that enables them to move on with their lives in a better way, which includes appropriate health care and support for the future. As some members have already said the chair of the inquiry, Sir Anthony Hart, recommended compensation, a memorial and a public apology to abused survivors. And it is sad that Sir Anthony Hart, who chaired the inquiry, did not live to see the victims get their compensation. In fact, I would go further. He was the only voice that many victims had for years in highlighting their plight. And can I, like other members, pay tribute to the Minister and his officials, and to David Sterling, Head of the Civil Service in Northern Ireland, his officials, in getting the bill thus far. And I think the work they have done have certainly come to an issue where it's been dealt with in this House this afternoon. And I want to raise the issue that Lord Brown raised, the whole issue of the institutions and their responsibility and the contribution that they need to make to the victims. And Lord Brown laid out examples where it has happened right across the world: Australia, Canada, America, Republic of Ireland, where the institutions have taken on their responsibility. And I hope that the Minister can give us some commitment that the institutions will pay their contribution to the victims. Can I also raise another issue? My understanding is there's around 500 victims so far has come forward, and I am told that there's about 2,500 victims altogether. And can I ask the Minister what steps can the Government take to identify those victims who has not yet come forward to the inquiry? But once again, I do welcome the second stage of this bill coming to the House, and I would hope that we can process the bill very quickly, and hopefully it can become law sooner rather than later.
My Lords, in September 2011, the Northern Ireland Executive announced that there would be an investigation and inquiry into historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland between 1922 and 1995. That announcement was welcome, and that inquiry allowed the voices of those so grievously abused over many decades finally to be heard. Sir Anthony Hart was commissioned to chair that inquiry, one of the most respected and distinguished judges of our time. The final report was published in January 2017, and although it was debated on the floor of the Northern Assembly, it was never actioned because of unnecessary political events that intervened. And although election was held on the 2nd of March 2017, Sinn Féin still remained unwilling to permit the Executive to be formed and the Assembly to function. However, 6 Stormont party leaders did write to the then Secretary of State, Karen Bradley, asking her to legislate to compensate victims of historical institutional abuse. She decided to put the HIA payment as an item on the Stormont talks, but sadly that did not achieve a resolution of the matter. She has since departed from her post. We thank her for her service, but the present Secretary of State, Mr. Smith, promised the HIA victims he would progress the legislation with urgent priority. My Lords, for more than a decade, campaigners have lobbied for compensation for victims abused in children's homes. The inquiry had exposed serious sexual, physical, emotional abuse over decades at children's homes under the control of religious orders, charities and state, and up to this moment justice has been denied. Many of the victims are now elderly, some in poor health. Others have passed away carrying the scars of their experiences to the grave. And although the late Sir Anthony Hart pleaded with politicians to act on his recommendations and provide the financial, social and educational support as a matter of urgency, it is only now we have this legislation before your Lordship's House. Action is urgently required, and we must not allow anything, including a possible election, to hinder the passage of this bill. Let us collectively determine to get this done And let this deep injustice be rectified without delay. Indeed, in our so doing would be a timely and lasting tribute to the late Sir Anthony, of whom it was said, "It was Sir Anthony who believed in victims. It was Sir Anthony who delivered the truth when others failed." I do not believe it should not allow an election to intervene, and therefore would ask the Minister these simple things. Will he assure us that accelerated passage will be used to progress this bill? Secondly, that the finances and funds are available to make the initial payments and also the payments that will be made whenever the final awards are made. And lastly, that those institutions responsible for this abuse are made to take responsibility not only in words, but by contributing to the funds to be distributed. I want to thank the Noble Lord, Minister, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland for their commitment to get this matter resolved and wholeheartedly support the second reading of this bill.
My Lords, I'm, like other Noble Lords, grateful to the Minister for not only bringing this piece of legislation to your Lordship's House, but also taking the trouble to make it clear to many of us in advance his own personal wish on behalf of the government to see this bill going through quickly and as quickly as possible. It's very clear that all Noble Lords, all members of the House, are of one mind on this matter, and I don't intend to detain the House for any length of time. I would want to mark up what the Noble Lord, Lord Cain, said in paying tribute to First and Deputy First Minister, Peter Robinson, Martin McGuinness, and Sir Anthony Hart for their contributions to making this report possible. It is a matter of distress to all of us, but most importantly to the victims and their families, that it has taken so long. But we are moving forward, and that at least is positive. I want also to note up what the Noble Lord, Lord HIA, said about victims and about money. Noble Lord, Lord Eames knows very well the dangers of money being mentioned in terms of adverse events and experiences that people have had, and how it can do damage to report if people get the wrong sense of it. But what's clear about this report is that it's not setting some kind of arbitrary limit. It's trying to move quickly, as quickly as possible, for those whose time is shorter, and then the rest can be dealt with later on, and that's a positive way forward. But the Noble Lord, Lord HIA, also mentioned the question of the victims. And I want to flag up from my own experience as a psychiatrist in Northern Ireland that while we think about those who have been abused as being the victims, and they absolutely are, the consequences go way, way beyond this. One of my colleagues, James Gilligan, a psychiatrist in the eastern seaboard of the United States, when he did work in prisons and institutions for the criminally insane, discovered that the overwhelming majority of those who engaged in dangerous psychotic violence were people who had themselves experienced some kind of abuse or violence. And so many of the families and others that victims will have come in contact with will have found themselves adversely affected, because while some victims end up working to protect others from any abuse, there are a substantial percentage of victims who themselves become abusers of others. So the consequences of all of this are absolutely enormous, much greater than we know. And to that extent, I also want to mention something that my noble friend Lord Bruce Abernathy mentioned right at the start, when he said that, in a sense, in this whole tragic business, Northern Ireland is taking a lead, and that the rest of the United Kingdom ought to pay attention. I remember when I was a young psychiatrist learning that there's an Egyptian psychiatrist in Northern Ireland who published a paper at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, where he was identifying instances of sexual abuse in Northern Ireland. And a number of people read this and said, well, of course, we're not too surprised about that happening in Northern Ireland. But of course, it doesn't happen over this side of the water. Well, of course, not very long after, they began to discover it was happening, and it was happening in enormous ways. And that has gone on to open itself up over the years in an absolutely catastrophic fashion. And so, my Lords, I want to mark up what my noble friend has said, because it is entirely possible that this is the Northern Ireland instalment of something that may come to haunt people over on this side of the water. And we must be ready for that. And the consequences financially in Northern Ireland and beyond are extremely significant. The noble Lord, the Minister, will be very aware that in another completely different situation in Scotland, it's going to become apparent that public funds are going to be difficult to find to pay for the amount of disadvantage that women have faced in employment practices. The consequences are going to be enormous, and I think it's quite possible that the financial consequences of this report could be much bigger than people imagine. So it should be for those who are victims, but that has knock-on consequences, as my noble friend has pointed out. This bill, no bill, is a perfect bill, particularly when dealing with a difficult situation. And my noble friend, Lady Ducey, has pointed out that there are issues to be raised, and I'm sure the noble Lord the Minister will respond to them. But we should never, ever, and particularly in these circumstances, make the ideal the enemy of the good. We have to move forward with this as quickly as we possibly can. It's going to be a very difficult and challenging business for those who work in the office of the Commissioner. Dealing with these kinds of things is a difficult process for those who are counsellors and therapists and civil servants who deal with the problems. They find themselves having to experience very profound discomfort and difficulty. Many of them may only be wise to stay in the work for a relatively short period of time because of the adverse consequences on their own emotional life of working with the degree of disturbance that they will experience in working with. But I do value the fact that the Commissioner is going to be given the responsibility not only for dealing with the mechanical, administrative and financial aspects, but also ensuring that those who are victims receive the proper psychological as well as social and physical care that they desperately need. For many, it will only be some kind of supportive assistance. The damage done is too great to ever be resolved, but at least there will be a recognition of the pain and damage that they have suffered and that their families have suffered too. And for that, at least, we should be grateful to the Minister and the Government for bringing this forward in what we all hope will be an accelerated passage.
Hear, hear. My Lords, just under 20 years ago, it fell upon me as the then Secretary of State for Wales to make a statement in the other place on the North Wales Child Abuse Inquiry, which had been chaired by another distinguished judge, Sir Ronald Waterhouse. It at that point uncovered the worst example of institutional abuse known in our country. And it led eventually to 72 recommendations, including the appointment of a Children's Commissioner for Wales, appointments which were then echoed in every other part of our nation. So today, unhappily, we are considering very similar events. And I, with many other members of your Lordship's House, pay tribute to the late Sir Anthony Hart for the tremendous and difficult job that he and his colleagues actually undertook. They oversaw and reported on a total abandonment of trust between adults and young people, the destruction of innocence and the destruction of lives, sometimes literally. And I think it's a tribute to the then Executive and Assembly that it decided to set up this inquiry in the first place. And the idea that the institutions in Northern Ireland weren't working properly, this alone indicates that they were, that together they looked at a very serious problem and decided to institute an inquiry upon it. Not in front of us today, but part of the recommendations of Sir Anthony included a proper, full public apology, which I gave on behalf of the people of Wales 2 decades ago, and which I think should obviously be done again, and the erection of a memorial somewhere on the estate in Stormont, which I think is a truly proper recognition of the suffering of all the youngsters over all those years. But today, of course, the House is charged specifically to agree to the appointment of a Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Child Abuse, the establishment of the Historical Institutional Abuse Redress Board, and a proper system for the compensation for the victims of abuse. And of course, the opposition entirely and wholly and fully supports the government on this bill. There are some issues, however, which I would ask the Minister to consider with regard to some of the detail of the bill. He might be able to do it now or at a later stage. Not too late, as we've indicated in our debate this afternoon. There should perhaps be a look at an immediate acknowledgement payment of £10,000 to those who meet the criteria, followed by larger redress payments when full details are being clarified. Some have argued that there shouldn't be an upper limit of £80,000 or £100,000 in the Australian case, because there may be some truly exceptional cases which require more, though I understand the constraints on the public purse. The bill should allow applicants for compensation, I believe, to request an oral hearing if they desire it, and I hope the government can consider that matter. And it should require the Redress Board to have due regard to the advice which is given to them by the Commissioner, him or herself. And finally, the criteria regarding the severity of abuse should take into account the duration of the stay in what are undoubtedly very harsh environments. Now, on the progress of the bill, I entirely agree with all the points that your Lordships have made with regard to telescope in the bill, because we live in unusual and difficult times. On the one hand, of course, the points I've just mentioned and others we need to raise by way of scrutiny. And we haven't, frankly, had enough scrutiny of bills in Parliament over the last number of weeks. But I do very much take the point. If we are on the edge of the dissolution of Parliament and a general election, we don't want this bill to fall. And so anything that the government can do to ensure its swift passage in this place and in the other place, obviously the opposition will absolutely agree with. And the other reason, of course, as a number of your Lordships have mentioned, is that some of the victims to which this applies are now old men and women, as old as me, because they go back to over 70. And I think that it's so important to realise that, because of ill health and so on, that we should deal with these matters as swiftly as possible, not simply because of the progress of the bill, but because of the fact that some people might literally die before they can be compensated. So I think, your Lords, my Lords, we owe it to them, we owe it to society in Northern Ireland and indeed in the United Kingdom for us to pass this admirable bill. And as I say, the government has our full support in it.
My Lords, it was remiss of me not to pay tribute to Sir Anthony Hart at the outset of my remarks, and I would like to correct that now. Without his labours in this area, we would not be where we are, and I think we all owe him and his memory a debt of gratitude. We can move this forward quickly. I think now more than ever it is essential that we do so, depending upon what happens in the other place, perhaps even later on today. I think it would be a useful legacy of this Parliament to deliver on historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland. I think that would be an inherently good thing to do. A number of specific points were raised, and I'm going to address those at the outset, if I may. The question of the role of the institutions themselves, and sometimes the wider sponsoring bodies of these institutions, we do need to look at how they shall be involved going forward. That was one of the elements of the original report, and we will not lose sight of this. The Executive Office will indeed look at this very carefully. The question of the adequate resourcing for this We cannot move this forward without absolute and utter certainty of resource, and that is a commitment which we can give here. The money will be met through the Northern Ireland Block Grant. It will be a statutory obligation, and it will be entirely adequate to take this matter forward. The noble Baroness Ducie, asked the question, how much would there be set aside for this? Whilst it is difficult, of course, without the certainty of the full scale of the number of victims who will come forward, current estimates of the cost are around £243 million, and £243 million will be found for this issue. But that cannot be a cap on it. This will be dependent upon the number of individuals themselves. The noble Baroness Ducie asked a number of other questions, which I will take in turn. The question of the 5-year time limit itself. This was a direct recommendation from the Hart Report, recommendation number 90, and was agreed by all the parties in Northern Ireland. The important thing to note, however, is that there is no limit on how long the Redress Board will function to process all the applications thereafter. The noble Baroness is correct to point out, however, that it's difficult to be sure that all those who are victims are able to come forward, and that is why one of the key roles and responsibilities of the incoming Commissioner will be this very purpose, to absolutely use every resource at their disposal to ensure that they are able to identify and by every means promote expressions of opportunity for those to come forward. That will be a real purpose that they must themselves recognise. As to the questions about, the specific question from Baroness Ducie about the cohabitation question, this is a more difficult one because it touches upon the wider question of family life. And what we have sought to do in this instance here is to try and ensure the clauses as drafted broadly fit in line with the existing clauses in other pieces of welfare legislation. And that is the reason why we have looked at it in the form that we have. We've tried to be, if you like, very straightforward in rather simple terms, trying to ensure that we are able to do that which is expected by other pieces of legislation. The noble Lord Bruce, asked the question again, which I would like to make sure is fully appreciated and understood, that this will be adequately resourced. There is no question of that. To do otherwise would be, frankly, remiss of us. The noble Lord Murphy raised a number of specific points at the end, and he said I might need longer to respond to them. I don't. I can respond to each of them right now, I believe. An immediate acknowledgement payment will be made. The individuals themselves, if they are eligible, simply have to be able to present their credentials forward, and that money will be made. Thereafter, a thorough investigation will necessarily take place, and that will be increased as appropriate case by case. As to the issue of oral hearings, yes, they will be possible, but not in every case, only where those are requested by the individuals themselves. We wouldn't wish this process to be slowed down by the notion of automatic hearings, but we are in no way going to try and prevent that from being necessary. The question of will the Redress Board listen and heed the Commissioner? Yes, I believe that is absolutely critical. That's the purpose of the Commissioner, and he must be able to express his views directly to the Redress Board. As to the wider question of the Redress Board, touching again on the point raised by the noble Baroness Ducie, it is absolutely essential that the Board is constituted in the most diverse and sensitive manner possible. For obvious reasons, this is a challenging area, and we must make sure that the individuals themselves have full confidence in the Board's composition, its integrity and its functionality. The noble Lord Murphy asked the question about would the duration of the stay of an individual in one of the institutions be a factor? Yes, it will. Not the only factor, but it will be taken into account as the consideration goes forward. As to the question of an upper limit, at the present moment it is set at 80,000. It can be adjusted on the basis of inflation. At the present moment, that is to help us try and encapsulate the overall cost of this, but I appreciate the point he's making, and I don't doubt that this may be an issue revisited at some point in the future. I think then, if I can just return very briefly to some of the other points raised by some of the other... I hope, before I lose track, that the noble Lord Murphy will accept that these are responses which are adequate to his purposes. If they're not, I'm very happy to write on any of these to provide the full clarification that may be required before we meet again. I wouldn't wish there to be any suggestion that any of this will interrupt our ultimate progress. I think if I can bring this to a relatively straightforward conclusion, I think there is unanimity in the House on this matter. I believe that all the questions that have been asked I've given a response to which is adequate. I believe on that basis that we can move forward with the expedited procedures to try and ensure that we bring together all of the elements of the series of stages as quickly and expeditiously as we can. I will be in touch through usual channels to determine how this shall be so, but it will be as quickly as I can humanly make it possible. I would like this to be a matter taken care of before the entanglements of any impending or future election, for obvious reasons. It is right that this be done now. It is right that it be done here. We must now, as quickly as we can, pass this completed bill down to the other place so that they too can act with the same expedition that we here have done. On that basis, my Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The content second.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be committed to a committee of the whole House.
The question is that this bill be committed to a committee of the whole House. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it. A repeat of a statement made in the House of Commons. Update on a major incident in Essex. Lord Bethell.